The auctioneer's hand was raised. He had read the property description, 160 acres, Decatur County, Georgia, parcel 14-019-B, and had begun the opening bid language when the back door of the room opened and Clifford Mays walked in. He was 68 years old. He walked without hurrying. He came down the center aisle past 40 neighbors in folding chairs, past 2 men from the bank's legal team sitting in the front row with matching briefcases, past the county clerk standing beside the podium. He stopped at the podium and placed a worn notebook on it, open to a page near the back. He said, "I need you to stop." The auctioneer looked at him. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the room. 37 minutes later, the proceeding was adjourned pending judicial review. The bank's legal team said nothing on the walk to the parking lot. Dennis Hensley left before the adjournment was announced. 3 months after that morning, the creditor's claim against Walt Hensley's estate was dismissed in full. The will contest filed by Dennis Hensley was withdrawn without explanation. The 160 acres remained in Clifford Mays' name, exactly as Walt Hensley had intended. What Clifford had said on that podium was a notebook. Walt had kept it for 19 years and stored it in a Greyhound bus depot locker in Bainbridge, Georgia. The locker number was 7. Clifford had held the key for 12 years without opening it. Here is how it started. Walt Hensley had farmed the 160 acres beside Clifford's property for longer than Clifford had been in Decatur County. When Clifford arrived in 1988 at the age of 34, Walt was already there, 58 years old, lean, unhurried, a man who farmed the way he talked, carefully and without waste. Their fence line ran 900 feet along the eastern edge. For 31 years, across that fence line, they shared what farm neighbors share. Equipment borrowed and returned, weather watched from the same ridge, 2 harvests compared without competition, the accumulated and unremarked understanding of how the other man did his work. The land had been Walt's since 1963, when he bought it from the county at auction for $4,100. 160 acres of South Georgia flatland that nobody else wanted that year. Red clay and wiregrass and one low-lying field that flooded in wet springs. Walt had worked that land for 56 years. He had drained the low field in 1971 with a drainage system he designed himself. He had planted longleaf pine on the north slope in 1979 and harvested part of it in 2001 and replanted it again. He had run cattle on the southern third since 1968, which meant he had been running cattle on that land for longer than many of his neighbors had been alive. Walt had never married. He had a nephew in Valdosta named Dennis who called at Christmas and sometimes not at Christmas. Walt did not speak about Dennis often. When he did, it was briefly and without particular warmth. What Walt spoke about, with more consistency and more care than almost any other subject, was the future of the land. What it would look like after him. Who would keep the drainage system maintained. Whether the longleaf pine on the north slope would be harvested responsibly or cleared for development the week after he was gone. He told Clifford once, on a July evening in 2009, standing at the fence line with the light going low across the fields, that he had revised his will. He said it plainly. He said, "You'll get this land when I'm gone. The condition is you keep it farmed. Don't sell it off. I know you won't." He paused. He said, "I know you won't." The way a man says something he has thought about for a long time and is finally saying out loud. Clifford said he would keep it farmed. Walt nodded. They stood at the fence a while longer and then went back to their separate work. Clifford did not ask for anything in writing. Walt did not offer it. They had been fence-line neighbors for 21 years, and neither of them felt the need. In the summer of 2010, a year after that conversation, Walt stopped Clifford one morning in the lane and held out a small brass key. It was flat, the kind cut for a padlock or a locker, worn smooth on the grip. There was a square of white tape on it, with a number written in Walt's small printing, L7. Walt said, "If this land ever gets into trouble after I'm gone, go to the Greyhound Depot in Bainbridge, locker 7. Get the notebook inside before you do anything else." Clifford asked what was in the notebook. Walt said, "A record of everything that matters." He went back to his tractor without adding anything further. Clifford put the key in the kitchen junk drawer when he got home. He thought of it occasionally over the next 9 years. The way you think of things you've put somewhere safe. Then Walt died in the spring of 2019. And the trouble came almost immediately. And in the weight of it, Clifford forgot about the key entirely. Walt Hensley died on March 11, 2019, at the age of 89. His will, executed in 2008 and revised in 2013 and again in December of 2017, left the 160 acres to Clifford Mays, with the farming condition attached. Dennis Hensley filed to contest it on April 29th, 49 days after Walt's death. The contest alleged undue influence, that Clifford, as a neighboring farmer with daily access to an elderly man living alone, had positioned himself over years to benefit from Walt's estate through ongoing manipulation. There was no documentary evidence supporting the claim. There was a nephew who stood to receive nothing under the will, and an attorney willing to argue that the absence of evidence was itself suspicious. The attorney in question was Grant Mallory, 47 years old, senior partner at a Tallahassee firm that specialized in estate litigation and creditor claims in agricultural property disputes across the Florida-Georgia corridor. Mallory had been retained not by Dennis Hensley directly, but by Southern Agricultural Credit Corporation, which held a $94,000 equipment loan against Walt's estate. The loan had been made in 2014, secured against a tractor, a combine, and 2 farm trucks. The bank wanted its $94,000. The land was the most liquid asset in the estate. Mallory's strategy was to let the will contest create enough legal uncertainty that the court would authorize liquidation of the primary asset to satisfy the debt before the estate dissolved into years of further litigation. He had used this approach in 4 prior cases. It had worked in 3 of them. He was precise, composed, and thorough in the way men are thorough when they are billing by the hour and losing belongs to someone else. Mallory spent 4 hours on Walt Hensley's estate file before filing the creditor's motion. Dennis Hensley's contest and Southern Agricultural's motion advanced in parallel for 3 years. At a preliminary hearing in August of 2022, Mallory spoke for 22 minutes. He laid out the creditor's claim, cited the outstanding debt, and argued that given the contested status of the will, liquidation of the primary estate asset was the only mechanism to ensure the debt satisfaction before the estate deteriorated further. Clifford's attorney at the time responded, but had not yet located the original loan documentation in the bank's own filing. The judge ruled for the creditor on the preliminary motion. The auction was set for October 14th, 2022. 3 neighbors called Clifford that evening. They were kind about it. They said they were sorry. They said they couldn't see how it could be stopped now. Clifford's daughter Lena arrived 2 days after the ruling to stay for a week. She came to help her father think, to help him go through options. On her second evening, she was cleaning the kitchen, keeping her hands busy, and she opened the junk drawer. She found the key near the back, beneath a handful of rubber bands and a flashlight battery. She held it up. On the white tape, L7. She asked her father what it was, and Clifford remembered. He drove to Bainbridge the next morning. It was 34 miles. The Greyhound Depot on West Street was quieter than he had expected. A waiting room with plastic chairs and a vending machine. The kind of place that still existed but had been largely bypassed by everything moving faster around it. The lockers were along the far wall, painted gray, numbered in raised black digits. He found locker 7 near the end of the row. He put the key in. It opened. Inside was a notebook. Brown cloth cover, approximately 200 pages. The binding worn at the spine from years of being opened and closed. Clifford took it outside and sat in his truck and opened it to the first page. Walt Hensley had started the notebook in January of 2000. The entries were dated, written in his small, unhurried print, and they recorded what Walt had considered worth recording. Equipment decisions, conversations with neighbors, observations about the land through the seasons, drainage measurements after wet springs. The early years were the ordinary life of a working farm. But beginning in 2007, a new thread appeared with increasing frequency: the future of the land. Walt wrote about meetings with his attorney. He wrote about the revision of his will. He wrote without sentiment and without excess, about Clifford, not as a friend exactly, though that was also true, but as a steward, a man fit for the purpose of the land. Walt's entries on this subject were consistent, repeated, and dated across 12 years. In 2015, and again in 2016, he recorded phone calls from Dennis asking him to consider selling while he was still alive and splitting the proceeds. Walt wrote the date, the request, and his refusal, each time in the same plain language. The final entry was dated March 1st, 2019. 10 days before Walt died. It read, "Spoke with attorney. Will is clear. Clifford Mays gets the land. My intention has not changed in 19 years and will not." Clifford sat in the truck for a long time. Then he drove to Ruth Ames's office. Ames had practiced estate and property law in Decatur County for 27 years. She was 59. She turned to the first entry of the notebook, and then the last, and then read several in the middle without speaking. She said, "A personal notebook isn't automatically a legal instrument. I need to understand the full scope before I know what we have." She read for another 12 minutes. Then she said, "Pull up the bank's creditor filing, specifically the exhibits. I want to see their loan documentation." Clifford's prior attorney had downloaded the full filing. Ames found Exhibit C, the original loan agreement Southern Agricultural had attached to their own court submission. She read the collateral section. She read it again. She set it on the table. She said, "The loan was secured against equipment, tractor, combine, 2 trucks. The land is not listed as collateral anywhere in this document." She looked at him. They filed this themselves. Their own exhibit says the land was never pledged to them. They have no legal basis to force its sale. She looked at the notebook. She looked at Exhibit C. She said, "We go to the auction." The auction was held in the county commissioner's meeting room in Bainbridge on the morning of October 14th, 2022. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs, a podium at the front. The auctioneer arrived at 9. Grant Mallory and his associate arrived at 9:08, front row, briefcases open. Dennis Hensley took the 3rd row and did not speak to anyone. By 9:25, there were 40 people in the room. Neighbors, most of them. People who had watched this move through the courts for 3 years and had called Clifford after the August ruling and said they were sorry. A few who had not called because they didn't know what to say. All of them believed the auction would proceed. There was no visible reason to think otherwise. The auctioneer called the room to order at 9:30. He read the property description. He noted the debt amount, $94,000 plus accrued interest and legal fees. He raised his hand to begin the opening bid. The back door opened. Clifford came down the center aisle without hurrying. He was wearing his good shirt. He passed the neighbors, past Mallory and his associate, past the county clerk. He set the notebook on the podium, open to March 1st, 2019. He said, "I need you to stop." Ruth Ames stepped beside him. She addressed the auctioneer and the clerk. She stated 2 grounds for halting the proceeding. First, the notebook, maintained across 19 years in Walt Hensley's own hand, established consistent testamentary intent that directly refuted the undue influence claim. And without a viable will contest, the estate's disposition was clear, and the creditor had no mechanism for liquidation. Second, Southern Agricultural Credit Corporation's own Exhibit C, attached to their own court filing, showed the $94,000 loan was secured against equipment only. The land was not pledged as collateral. The bank held no legal claim against it. She set Exhibit C on the podium beside the notebook. Mallory was on his feet. He objected to the procedure, to the timing, to the validity of a personal notebook as a legal instrument. He was precise and composed, and it took visible effort to remain both. The county clerk stepped away and called the judge's chambers. She was on the phone for 4 minutes. When she returned, she announced the proceeding was adjourned, pending judicial review of the materials presented. The auctioneer lowered his hand. No one spoke. Mallory sat back down slowly. He looked at the notebook on the podium for a moment. Then he looked at the wall. Dennis Hensley was already gone. The court's review took 3 weeks. At the end of it, the creditor's motion was dismissed. Southern Agricultural's loan documentation did not support a forced sale of land never pledged as collateral. With the creditor's motion gone, Dennis Hensley's will contest had nothing behind it. He withdrew it on November 18th through his attorney, without a statement. The 160 acres remained in Clifford May's name. Clifford drove home the afternoon the dismissal was confirmed. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck with the window down. The field was quiet. A cold front had come through the night before, and the November air was clear and still, and the light was that particular flat brightness that comes after a front moves through South Georgia. He sat there for a while, then he called Lena. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear her kids in the background. Some argument over something small, the way kids argue, loud for a moment, and then already moving on. Lena said, "Dad?" He said, "It's done." There was a pause, and then she laughed. A short, full laugh. The kind that comes out before you've decided to laugh. He could still hear the kids behind her, going on about their afternoon. He sat with the window down and listened to all of it for a moment. The field, the sound of Lena's house, the ordinary noise of things continuing. Then he said goodbye and hung up and got out of the truck and went to work. Walt Hensley had started that notebook in January of 2000 at the age of 70. Not because anything was wrong, but because he understood that what is written survives and what is not written may not. He had written in it for 19 years. He had driven to a bus depot in Bainbridge and put a key in a neighbor's hand with one sentence of instruction and had never mentioned it again, because the notebook was doing its work, whether he mentioned it or not. On March 1st, 2019, 10 days before he died, he had written his last entry and closed the cover. And the notebook had waited in locker 7 for 3.5 more years until a brass key turned in a padlock and the work it had been waiting to do finally arrived. That is what 19 years of small, careful handwriting looks like when the moment comes. It doesn't look like a legal victory. It looks like a worn brown cover on a podium in a room that had expected to hear a gavel. Tell me in the comments, if those neighbors had called you the night of the preliminary ruling and said it was over, would you have kept fighting, or would you have looked for a settlement? I read everyone. And subscribe. Next time, a 72-year-old woman in Blount County, Tennessee, received a letter from a company claiming her late husband had signed away the mineral rights to their farm 11 years before he died. There was one problem with that claim. The signature wasn't his, and she had the document that proved it. We'll see you there.